2040 or at the latest by 2050. And the phase 3, the controlled depopulation phase, which has already started in several European nations as well as Japan, but that will not start for the rest of the world until the population peaks, seeks to ensure that the global population gradually decreases to a sustainable level. What is a sustainable population very much depends on our standard of living and on the technology we use to enable that standard of living. The higher our standard of living and the filthier our technology, the smaller the sustainable population will be. Conversely, the lower our standard of living and the cleaner the technology, the higher the sustainable population will be. Clearly, we must strike the right balance between our standard of living and the technology we use, so we fall victim neither to poverty and pollution nor to tyranny and genocide. Whatever choice we make in terms of standard of living and technology, however, will be ultimately determined by the number of people on the planet, because we live on a finite planet that only has so much to give, and that can give even less if its life support systems are to remain healthy. The demographic transition, as presented to the general public, is defined as the transition from high birth and death rate to low birth and death rates, as a country develops from a pre-industrial to an industrialized economic system. The general public, however, is not being told that this engineered transition implies that births and deaths are to be controlled by policies and not by nature, so that the birth and the death rates are brought into a perfect equilibrium. To accomplish this, births have to be limited and deaths have to be managed, and this requires the government to subvert fertility throughout the 5 stages of the demographic transition and promote death during the 4th and especially the 5th and last stage of the demographic transition. Since births are best prevented by damaging the reproductive system and deaths are best promoted by weakening the immune system, this is what our elected governments are doing, therefore rendering our fundamental rights and civil liberties null and void. The rule of law, a fiction, and democratic checks and balances a fraud. In effect, what governments are trying to do is re-establish nature's lost equilibrium between life and death, an equilibrium disturbed by human intervention. Because in a purely natural state, a state that we have always sought to escape, but that we only finally and fully succeeded with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, fertility and mortality are both very high. That is to say, a lot of children are born, but few survive to adulthood. In a purely natural state, human life is also a lot shorter, as few reach old age. In fact, prior to 1945, the average lifespan was just 45 years, but today it is almost double that at circa 70 years. Due to advances in medicine, nutrition, and sanitation, nearly every child born survives to adulthood and lives a long life. And because nearly every child survives and every human being lives a long life, the population has exploded. In the engineered society of today, nature's equilibrium between life and death is mirrored, but at much lower levels. For while in a state of natural births and deaths are at high levels, higher than 50 per 1,000, in the engineered society of today, the goal is to bring both births and deaths down to about 10 per 1,000. Fewer births and fewer deaths mean less hardship and suffering, and the enduring goal of civilization is to free man from nature, because a life at the mercy of nature is both harsh and painful. The population explosion experienced since the onset of the Industrial Revolution in 1780 resulted in swelling cities and urban poverty during the latter half of the 19th century, as well as in heavy migration out of Europe to the Americas and other colonies gained by military force. Then it resulted in the 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century and 80 million deaths. Then in the rapid depletion of non-renewable resources and fierce competition for them. More recently, in unsustainable growth and chronic poverty and hunger throughout the developing world, and increasingly throughout the developed world as well. And most recently, in worldwide environmental damage and the threat of irreversibly changing the climate. The latter three developments, namely the depletion of non-renewable resources, increasing poverty and starvation due to unsustainable growth rates, and worldwide environmental damage, have occurred despite an intense effort to control population growth through covert chemical, biological, psychosocial, and economic methods that amount to a hidden war against fertility and health, a war waged by governments and their military-industrial complex. A war that is wholly responsible for the explosion of non-communicable diseases, which is why the demographic transition is mirrored by the epidemiologic transition. And the stakes of this war are high. They are in fact global, and therefore the highest in our history. No greater war has ever been waged, for we are all at the receiving end of this war, both as victims and as beneficiaries. The moment you start interfering with human fertility to bring it down to replacement level, thus to just 2 children per woman, you start ending mankind's economic and social problems, but you also begin causing unprecedented medical and political problems that defy moral solutions. For as you interfere with fertility over multiple generations and reduce the number of children born at any given age cohort, you alter the structure of society from a stable pyramid to an unstable inverted pyramid. And the same happens to human health. For as you subvert fertility with endocrine disruptors, you subvert all human health. And with each generation you have feebler and sicker people whose health is degraded and genetic makeup degenerated. Having set in motion a train that cannot be stopped, you are forced to do whatever it takes to get the population structure to a stable state, and until such time, manage human health as best you can. In other words, all you can do is mitigate for the damage you cause in order to accomplish those vital demographic objectives. A stable population state looks like a bullet in graphic terms. But to get to this population profile from an inverted population pyramid, you have to shave off the wings of the inverted pyramid. In other words, you have to get rid of the elderly because there are too many of them in the 4th and 5th stages of the demographic transition, and too many elderly pose an unbearable fiscal burden on state budgets at a time when the working population is shrinking. As the war against fertility tapers off in the latter stages of the demographic transition, the war against longevity begins. Since the developed world started to wage war on their people's fertility first, it is the first to have to start waging war on their people's longevity. And regardless how the political leaders of developed countries feel about sending their elderly into an early grave, they have little choice under the current system, since failing to do so would result in fiscal collapse. The dependency burdens posed by the elderly in countries where they make up more than 20% of the total population is unsustainable, especially since these countries are hit with the other effects of the demographic transition all at the same time: a smaller workforce, a dwindling tax pool, a lower productivity. All countries with a median age of 35 years or more, which are represented on this map in blue and purple, are currently waging war on their people's longevity. Russia does it with alcohol, China with tobacco, and the West with vaccines and pharmaceuticals. In addition, most countries with an aged population augment the war against their people's longevity with GMOs and chemtrails since the beginning of the 21st century. Japan, Germany, and Italy, who lost the Second World War and were consequently subjected to the most brutal methods of population control, already have more than a quarter of their people over 65 years of age. By 2035, 1 in 3 Japanese will be over 65, and Italy and Germany will be no different. The war against longevity will therefore intensify, and the problems it will cause in the population at large can only be grave. The results of the wars on fertility and longevity are dire. They are hidden behind the euphemism epidemiologic transition. Plummeting birth rates from 7 children globally in 1950 to 2.6 today and exploding non-communicable diseases are two sides of the same coin, the engineered depopulation coin. For you cannot subvert the reproductive system without damaging the entire body, which is why as fertility has gone down, morbidity has gone up. Reproduction is simply too important to the survival of the species, and when it goes, everything else goes with it. It is the attack on the human reproductive system that doctors must stop if the epidemic of non-communicable diseases is to stop. The world has experienced an epidemiologic transition in the leading causes of death from infectious disease and acute illness to chronic disease and degenerative illness. Chronic disease has replaced infection as the primary cause of death, not due to the expanded public health and sanitation, as conventional theory would have it, but because governments have waged war on reproduction and in the process have damaged the entire endocrine system and with it all human health. We are in the age of degenerative and man-made diseases due to the war on fertility. Abdel Omran, who formulated the epidemiological transition theory, was correct in stating that the epidemiological transition occurs as a country undergoes the process of modernization from developing nation to developed nation status. But he was incorrect in ascribing this transition to modern healthcare and medicines and their ability to drastically reduce infant mortality rates and extend average life expectancy. This transition is purely the result of chronic, multi-generational, and deliberate poisoning with endocrine disruptors. In the absence of this steady assault, most human beings would die of natural causes and would live in good health until the very end. Moreover, in the absence of these poisons, average lifespan would be at least 90 years. Epidemiological studies at the level of populations are crucial to alert researchers about geographical and secular trends in prevalence of disorders, pointing to possible environmental factors. You need look no further to find the primary determinant of non-communicable diseases. It is the deliberate use of endocrine disruptors for population control purposes. I'm happy to see that epidemiologists are on the right track and have begun formulating a theory of chronic disease that suggests knowledge of the multi-pronged assault that governments commit against the people for population control purposes via chemical, biological, psychosocial, and economic methods. Endocrine disruptors have been recently identified as pro-inflammatory biomarkers for measuring metaflammation, the type of prolonged, dysregulated, and maladaptive inflammatory response associated with reduced metabolic rate. And research is now underway that seeks to identify the nutritional, behavioral, and environmental inducers of these pro-inflammatory biomarkers, inducers that have been labeled anthropogenes because of their man-made origins. These inducers, it is now recognized, include not only behaviors linked to modern lifestyles facilitated by post-industrial environments, for example, poor nutrition, inactivity, inadequate sleep, and stress, but also components of these environments themselves, such as particulate matter and traffic-related air pollution, endocrine disrupting chemicals, social and economic conditions that create inequality and economic insecurity. I am happy to see that toxicologists in the European Union are working hard to identify all endocrine disrupting chemicals presently in the environment, and that the process of removing these toxic chemicals from our environment and especially from our food system has begun. I'm even happier to tell you that this work is no longer being stalled by the chemical industry and the European Commission due to the direct threats I made to every head of state and government in Europe and beyond, and due to the scientific evidence of genocide that I have presented in my seminal work, Peace Without Poison, which removed all corporate and political obstacles to the cessation of covert chemical methods of depopulation. To date, 163 endocrine disrupting chemicals have been added to the list of substances of very high concern. I am happy to tell you that several European nations have taken unilateral steps to accelerate the process of removing these endocrine disrupting chemicals from the food system. Sweden, France, and Denmark now lead the way. The French government has stated since June 2014 that there is sufficient evidence endocrine disruptors are harmful to the human